Of all the silences in the world, the one that existed inside Arthur Pendleton's penthouse was the most expensive and the most profound. It was a silence curated by acoustic paneling, enforced by double-paned glass that muted the city of Ethelberg 30 floors below, and polished to a high sheen by the absence of any real life. Arthur stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal tumbler of 25-year-old Macallan in his hand, and watched the ant-like traffic crawl along the rain-slicked streets. He was 52 years old, and he had amassed a fortune so vast he could no longer accurately comprehend its scale. He owned a yacht, a private jet, a collection of vintage cars that slept in a climate-controlled garage, and a profound, soul-crushing emptiness that none of his possessions could fill. The phone on his onyx desk, a sleek black obsidian slab, buzzed. His assistant, Eleanor, her voice perpetually calm and efficient, filtered through the intercom. "Mr. Pendleton, the final signatures for the Pendleton-Morris merger are ready. Congratulations, sir. It's a historic deal. A historic deal. It would add another several billion to his net worth." Arthur felt nothing, not a flicker of triumph, not a spark of satisfaction. It was just another line of code in the vast, invisible ledger of his life. He took a slow sip of the amber liquid, its complex notes of oak and spice failing to register on his numb palate. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, hollow echo in the vast room. "Hold all my calls for the rest of the day." He ended the communication before she could respond. He turned from the window, his eyes scanning the penthouse. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design, every piece of furniture a sculptural statement, every artwork a calculated investment. It was perfect, and it was a gilded cage. He felt like a specimen in a museum of his own success, preserved under glass for a public that admired the shell but never saw the rotting core. A memory, sharp and unbidden, surfaced from the depths of his mind. He was 8 years old, sitting on the porch of his grandfather's dilapidated farmhouse. The wood was splintered, the paint peeling. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and damp earth. He was drinking lemonade from a chipped, mismatched glass, his feet dangling, not quite touching the floorboards. His grandfather, a man with hands like worn leather and a laugh that sounded like rocks tumbling in a stream, was telling a story about a fox that outsmarted a hunter. Arthur remembered the feeling, not the story itself, but the feeling of being utterly, completely, and unremarkably content. It was a sensation he had spent the next 44 years trying and failing to recapture. An idea began to form in the sterile emptiness of his mind. It was not a plan, not a strategy. It was a desperate, wild impulse. What if he could go back? Not to the farmhouse, that was long gone, but to that feeling. What if he stripped it all away? The money, the name, the burden of success. What if he became nobody? The thought was so audacious, so fundamentally insane, that it felt like the first sane thought he'd had in a decade. He wouldn't just take a vacation. He wouldn't just get away. He would disappear. He would become a ghost in the machine of his own life. He spent the next week in a state of feverish, secretive planning. This was not a corporate takeover. It was a personal surrender. He used his formidable intellect not to acquire, but to divest. He transferred the bulk of his assets into an ironclad blind trust, managed by a single ruthlessly discreet lawyer named Mr. Blackwood. The instructions were simple. The trust would pay out a minuscule, predetermined monthly sum, just enough for bare subsistence, to a bank account under a new anonymous identity. Arthur Pendleton, the billionaire, would effectively vanish. The man who emerged would be Arthur Pym, a man with no history, no connections, and a little over $300 a month to his name. He told Eleanor he was taking an extended, uncontactable sabbatical to a remote part of the world. He packed a single worn duffel bag with the plainest clothes he owned, items without labels, things he had to specially order to achieve such studied anonymity. He left his watch, his wallet, his phone, all the talismans of his old life, on the onyx desk. He took one last look around the penthouse, not with nostalgia, but with the detached curiosity of an archaeologist examining the ruins of a lost civilization. Then he walked out, taking the service elevator down to the garage, and drove away in a nondescript sedan he had purchased for cash the day before. His destination was the King's Cross district, Ethelberg's underbelly. It was a place of crumbling brickwork, flickering neon signs, and a constant, low-grade hum of desperation. Here, the silence of his penthouse was replaced by a symphony of sirens, shouting, and the clatter of dumpsters. The air was a thick stew of exhaust fumes, greasy food, and uncollected garbage. He found a flophouse called The Anchor, a building that seemed to be held upright by sheer force of habit. The man at the front desk, a sallow-faced individual with a permanent squint, didn't even look up. 20 a night, pay in advance, no refunds. Arthur Pym now, handed over a crumpled $20 bill. The room he was given was a cube of despair. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling. The bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame, stained with the ghosts of 1,000 previous occupants. The walls were a sickly green, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall a few feet away. It was the absolute antithesis of his penthouse. It was perfect. The first few days were a brutal physical shock. The constant noise made sleep nearly impossible. The food from the local soup kitchen was bland and starchy. His body, accustomed to Egyptian cotton and ergonomic pillows, ached from the lumpy mattress and the hard, unforgiving streets. He was cold, he was hungry, and he was constantly on edge. But amidst the discomfort, something strange was happening. The suffocating emptiness inside him was being replaced by a raw, animal need for basic survival. His mind, once occupied with stock fluctuations and merger arbitrage, was now wholly focused on finding a warm place to sit, a decent meal, and avoiding the predatory gazes of the district's more dangerous inhabitants. He met people, not the sycophants and strategists of his old world, but real, fractured human beings. There was Maggie, a sharp-tongued woman in her 60s who had lost her job and then her apartment to medical debt, and who now possessed a vast, intricate knowledge of the city's shelter system. There was Leo, a grizzled, one-legged veteran who spoke in cryptic philosophical riddles and guarded his spot near the heating vent of the public library with territorial ferocity. And there was Billy, a young, hollow-eyed kid who couldn't have been more than 19, whose tremors and frantic energy spoke of a life derailed by addiction. Arthur Pym didn't try to help them. He couldn't. He was one of them. He listened. He learned. He discovered the precise time the bakery on 5th Street threw out its day-old bread. He learned which park benches were safest to sleep on and which were patrolled by overzealous security guards. He felt the humiliating sting of being ignored by passers-by, the invisible cloak of poverty that rendered him a non-person. One evening, huddled in his room at the Anchor, shivering under a thin, scratchy blanket, he experienced a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. He was miserable. He was physically wretched, and for the first time in 20 years he was not bored. The gnawing hunger in his stomach was a more honest sensation than the ennui he had felt at a 7-course Michelin-starred meal. This life was hard, it was ugly, and it was undeniably, brutally real. He had wanted to feel something, and the universe had answered with a sledgehammer. His new existence settled into a grim routine. Mornings were spent in line at the soup kitchen, afternoons were in the public library, absorbing the free warmth and the forgotten scent of books. Evenings were for scavenging and trying to find a semi-secure place to spend the night. He stopped seeing the people around him as a monolith of the homeless. He saw them as individuals, each with a story, a loss, a crack in their life through which they had fallen. He saw the cunning in Maggie's eyes, the deep, unhealed wound behind Leo's gruff exterior, the desperate fading hope in Billy's. One bitterly cold night, the city was gripped by an unseasonable freeze. The shelters were overflowing. Arthur, along with Maggie, Leo, and a shivering Billy, found a precarious refuge in the recessed doorway of a closed-down bank. The wind howled down the concrete canyon of the street, slicing through their layers of donated clothing. They huddled together for warmth, a small island of human misery in the vast, indifferent city. Billy was in a bad way. His tremors were violent, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Can't feel my feet," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. Arthur acted on instinct. It wasn't Arthur Pendleton, the billionaire, who would have written a check to a homeless charity. It was Arthur Pym, the man who was cold. He took off his own threadbare jacket, ignoring the immediate bite of the wind, and wrapped it around Billy's shoulders. He then sat behind the young man, pulling him against his own body, sharing what little warmth he had. Maggie, on Billy's other side, did the same, creating a pathetic human windbreak. "Deep breaths, kid," Leo grumbled from his spot beside them, his voice raspy. "The cold's a bully. You can't let it see you're scared." They stayed like that for what felt like hours, a knot of shared humanity against the elements. Arthur felt Billy's shivering slowly subside, replaced by an exhausted sleep. In that moment, covered in grime, shivering in the cold, giving away his only real protection, Arthur felt a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. It was a connection, a purpose, however small and fleeting. He was keeping a kid from freezing to death. It was the most important thing he had done in years. The old Arthur Pendleton would have analyzed the cost-benefit, the long-term solution. The new Arthur simply acted. And in that action, he found a sliver of the peace that had eluded him his entire life. He had become a mendicant, a beggar, and in the act of having nothing, he had finally found something worth having. As the first grey light of dawn stained the sky, washing out the neon signs, a city sanitation truck rumbled down the street. The noise woke Billy. He blinked, confused, then looked at Arthur, who was still huddled behind him. You kept me warm," Billy whispered, his voice raw. Arthur just nodded, his body stiff and aching. Maggie looked at him, her sharp eyes softening just a fraction. "You're not like the others who end up here, are you, Arthur Pym?" she said, not as a question but as a statement. "There's no fear in your eyes, just a different kind of tired." Arthur met her gaze and gave a small, weary smile. It was the first genuine smile that had touched his lips in a very, very long time. He had set out to discover what it was like to have nothing. He had discovered instead what it was like to be something, to be human. The road ahead was still dark and uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. He had found his fox, his grandfather's story, his chipped glass of lemonade. It wasn't in a place or a possession. It was here, in the shared warmth of a desperate huddle on a cold street. The millionaire was gone. The man who was left was finally, truly rich. This journey from gilded cage to gritty truth, from having everything to discovering what everything really means, is a story that resonates with the deepest parts of our humanity. If you were captivated by Arthur's transformation, if you found yourself questioning the very nature of wealth and purpose alongside him, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to our channel, The Millionaire Who Wanted to Be a Beggar. Here, we delve into the stories that matter, tales of radical transformation, of hidden truths found in the most unlikely places, and of the profound strength discovered not in wealth, but in the human spirit. Click subscribe now and join our community. Your next journey into the heart of what truly makes us human is just a click away.